It's day 4 of the Airthings Masters, which means that it's the first day of the quarterfinals. Magnus Carlsen, Daniel Dubov, Hikaru Nakamura versus Levon Aranyan, Wesley So versus Maxim Vasheligrov, Timur Rajabov versus Jan Nepomniachtchi. The way this works is that they play rapid chess today, 15-minute games, and then they come back tomorrow for more rapid chess, and if the match after all that is tied 1-1, then they play some blitz. I've got a scoreboard for you, and I got a very funny clip of Magnus Carlsen, but I'm going to save that for the middle of the video. We kick things off with the game between Magnus and Dubov, and this one, it was a slow game to start off. In fact, this was a very kind of common Ruy Lopez, a very early move d5. The game was not terribly exciting and interesting until this moment, when Magnus Carlsen traded the light squared bishops and mobilized his queen to the queen side. He then proceeded to trade off the knight on f4 and play rook d1 and start to threaten the advancement of his pawn. Queen came to d7, knight to c5, queen f5, and he took the a6 pawn. A nice little tactical trick. If rook takes a6, you have rook e8, and if rook takes, and then you take my knight, I have a back rank checkmate. So Magnus got out to this position where he takes the b5 pawn and is a pawn up in the endgame. Now, the important thing about an endgame like this is the fact that he's got the outside pass pawns here, the A and the B pawns, which can be annoying, especially in any king and pawn endgames, to deflect the bishop or the king or the rook somewhere to this side while this pawn constantly threatens promotion, okay? This is going to be important for later, okay? Pay attention. Knight c3, take, g6. So now we start to advance those pawns, and you're going to notice throughout this endgame as Magnus makes a little fort for his king, nice and instructive, queen and rook endgame, goes for the simplification and sacrifices his c-pawn and puts the rook behind the pawn. A lot of little things here. Outside pass pawn, rook behind the pawn, safety net for your king. A lot of little details here that you can learn from. Rook b3, keeps pushing the pawn. Now he starts bringing his king. Keeps bringing his king. And then here, watch, this is brilliant. This is, Magnus Carlsen is a dementor, you know, from Harry Potter. He sucks the happiness out of you. Watch what he makes Dubov go through in this endgame. He checks him until, right, the king gets shuffled. He makes his king a bit more active. And he utilizes a check to make Dubov take this with his king, not his rook. And now he leaves his king there. From a pawn up, Magnus goes a pawn down, but because his position is so active, his rook cuts the king from all sorts of activity. Then he uses the threat of mate. It's never too late to hang a checkmate. He uses this against him, wins the pawn back. Dubov goes for a pawn sacrifice in order to damage Magnus' structure. Magnus not interested. Instead keeps his structure altogether. Uses the threat of mate to lure the king to a4. Check. Pick up the f4 pawn for the h2 pawn. And then rook to f7. Excuse me. Rook n2 versus rook n2. He creates a passed pawn, giving Dubov one of his own as well, but his pawn is faster and his king is more active, doing what's called shouldering, boxing the king out, and Dubov unable to defend this position. Gets his pawn hunted down while Magnus just casually advances his pawn, hides his king behind the pawn to get out of checks, rook a4, f7, and in this position Magnus Carlsen doesn't promote. Because the trick, the one final trick, 4 endgame techniques you just learned watching this recap video. Rook takes h4. Why? Rook f1, you use the rook as a shield. This is a concept known as building the bridge. You should look this up after this recap video if you want a cool one. I don't have a video on it yet. Unless you're watching like in 2021, late 2021, then I probably have a video on that. But I don't have a video on that yet. I haven't made a rook and pawn endgame video. But building the bridge is what that's called. And Magnus Carlsen gets out to a 1-0 lead. The other game that I'm going to show you from this round is the one between Nepo and Rajabov. Wesley So and MVL drew in the first round, and so did Hikaru and Levon Aranyan. So now we are going to look at the game between Timur Rajabov, I don't even know what name I just tried to say, Rajabov and Jan Nepomniachtchi. Again, this one was a classical opening. It was a Queen's Gambit declined. It's known as the exchange variation, and Nepo here plays a plan. If you notice, he doesn't move his knight to f3, which in the Queen's Gambit exchange variation is actually what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to play f3 and e4 and develop your pieces like this. Boom, you just learned something again. Look at that. Now, he sets up everything to do it, and then he says, Levy, I'm not going to listen to you, I'm going to play knight f4. No one has ever played knight f4. Literally, if you look at this transformation without the move e4, this has never happened. This actually legitimately in the database, I did not find anything relevant to this game, and it made the game turn into total chaos. But that's generally what happens when Jan Nepomniachtchi is involved in a game. And it's crazy. I mean, Radjabov is trying to expand on the queen side with his pawns. Nepo routes his pieces to the other side. Plays a lot of really intriguing and weird moves over there, even at some point baiting Radjabov into this, and this is still fine for white because the king just goes back, as weird as it looks. And it was a slugfest, and look at this. Radjabov starts marching down the board. There was only one moment in this game that was really interesting, and it was here when bishop h4 happened, attacking the rook, and Radjabov could have played the ultra gangster prison chess move, king g7. And the point is that after you take, I open the rook like this, and I get this massive h-file attack on you. Just say, take my damn rook, I don't need it. That's called relative value, because the bishop is worth more than the rook. The bishop is just more powerful. Radjabov did something similar and tried to advance with his pawn, but then he went back and, you know, there was this trade. And I think if this wasn't the first game of the knockout, Radjabov could have been a bit more risk prone. But what ended up happening is what ends up happening when two super... They're all a tease, okay? Super GMs are just one giant tease. They traded everything, and this endgame was played out for 30 more moves. Rather than, you know, waste your time showing queens and pawns shuffling around the board, I'm just going to say that this was a draw, okay? But that was one very cool moment. We move ahead to the second round. And the first game from the second round that I'm going to show you is this one between Levon Aranyan and Hikaru Nakamura. But first, I did say I had a funny clip. There was a game being played in the second round between Magnus Carlsen and Daniel Dubov, okay? And in the middle of that game, this happened. And I'm muting it for copyright, but I'm going to voice it over. Someone came into the room of Magnus Carlsen. Magnus was shown going, "Hey, I don't want free cake. Get that out of here. I don't want any sugar right now. Just bring me my orange juice." "No, I said orange juice. I don't want apple juice, damn it. What are you doing? Give me orange juice." Yeah, so I don't exactly know what happened there. The theory is that the house cleaning housekeepers came to the room there with Magnus Carlsen. But the game in the second round between him and Dubov did end in a draw, although Magnus was under some pressure. So Dubov was kind of clawing back, but Magnus and Dubov are half-half. The game that I'm going to show is first between Levon and Hikaru. This one was a London, which is kind of rare to see. I mean, it's an opening that many of you learn. And Hikaru went for a unique line, and here, Levon played a move that I've never seen in my life in this particular position, bishop to b5. Now, normally, there's c6, and that's it, conversation is over. But in this case, we get knight d7, c3, and Hikaru just avoided that bishop. What ends up happening in the middle game, by the way, notice, the golden rule of the London, if black can play e5 successfully, black has no problems. So what does Levon do? Put something in the middle, they swap off a bunch of pieces, and what happens here? Well, it's a battle of the bishops is what this is. Both sides are arguing that their bishop is the superior bishop. And of course, actually, both bishops look really dominant. I mean, those are prime outposts, right? If you don't follow me on Instagram, go follow Gothamchess on Instagram. 1 in every 3 posts that I make is instructive chess content. It's not like, you know, whatever you use Instagram for. Don't tell me what you use Instagram for. But I have a post there on outposts and how to use them and all that good stuff. So anyway, we get b6, f4, and watch how Levon just takes this position to the next level here against Hikaru. He plays king f2, then he plays rook h3, then he plays rook g3, then he plays rook g5, okay? Then he opens the other side of the board for the constant lingering threat of a queen invasion and plays c4. Why does he play c4? Because now this dark squared diagonal is going to have a piece on it besides the bishop. One little pawn move changes the entire game. Hikaru tries to scramble back on defense. Levon, meanwhile, continues to expand on that side. down the middle with a constant threat. He's playing on 3 sides of the board here. Hikaru plays rook c8, b3, queen c6, rook h1. The second rook has arrived to maintain this pressure. And the real question is, how do you break through in a position like this, right? Like, black is defending everything. This is protected 3 different ways, so you're not going to get in on that square. Except the truth is you actually are going to get in on that square. When you have such tremendous pressure, if it looks like you can't reach your breaking point, look for a sacrifice. And in this case, rook g6 is a killer move because after queen g6, which is what happened in the game, you find an infiltration. And if this has no guard anymore, black's position falls apart. Rook h6, we win the queen. And if this, we take, and that's it. I mean, good luck, right? Because now this legendary bishop is completely out of the game. In fact, in the game, the bishop basically never moved again. Queen takes g6. The bishop is just standing there. King to g1. He brings the king to safety on h2. And then he finds a way in. Queen a1. Queen a4. Queen c6. Hikaru takes and plays rook b1, but this is just game over. And Levon Aragnan wins in the second game to take a 1.5 to half lead versus Hikaru. The other game from this round between Nepo and Rajabov ended in a draw, a relatively peaceful affair. And so for the last game from the second round, I have Wesley So with the white pieces, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave with the black pieces. If Maxime is black and Wesley plays e4, what is Maxime going to play? You are absolutely right. He is going to play the Najdorf. This is the Najdorf Sicilian. Bishop e3, they threaten us with a repetition, but we threaten them with a good time. Bishop g5. Bishop rotates this way. This is theory, as stupid as it looks. Perhaps the stupidest move of this entire variation. This is all theory, by the way, all of this. In this position, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave plays a move, knight to f3 check, which just looks like it hangs a knight 2 different ways, but this is the point, that after this, you sacrifice the second piece. But white cannot play king e2, because then knight d4, and it's almost mate, you have to lose your queen. So this. You know the best part about this position is? This is completely insane. The position is just, I mean, it's bogus. And yet, Maxime had this before. He had this against Anish Giri last year, and I called it. I actually remembered that during the live broadcast. He had it against Anish Giri last year in August in a rapid event, I believe, in Europe, in the Grand Chess Tour. But this game was a wild game, and I'll tell you why it was a wild game. First, Wesley allowed a pawn to be taken, and then just let that pawn live there. Watch. He takes on d4, and then there's this, and here, there's just a repetition of moves. So first of all, he loses another pawn, and what he should do here is he should just repeat. Just repeat the moves. But Wesley thought that he had something, and he played a very creative move, knight to e3, walking into a fork. Don't do that. Don't walk into a fork. That's painful. Rook f8. What is the count of material? It is rook and 4 pawns, which is 9 for three pieces. For knight, bishop, bishop, which is also 9. So black has a rook and 4 pawns, white has 3 pieces. What the hell is going on in this game? Can someone please explain it to me? Well, I'll tell you right now. Bishop h4 attacking the rook, e5 gluing it all together, queen to e4 takes the knight with check, king g3 takes on f2 with check, and now king to h2, and now, I mean, this game had everything. Under promotion to a knight with check, bishop f1, and rook c8. The rook is coming. And it did. And now this rook also lines itself up to hit the bishop. And then we get this. Rook f7, queen g4, and rook c2. Okay, this cannot be taken. And by the way, I just have to say, like, queen d8 looks nice, but you're not gonna win the game here. I'm just gonna go king e6, and you can never mate me because I'm constantly threatening to take your bishop. So what happens in the game? We get bishop h4, rook f3. The cool thing about rook f3, it's a very creative move. It threatens rook takes h3 mate. You say, Levy, why can't that be taken? Because this rook is pinning the bishop to the king, and rook takes h3 is checkmate because bishop cannot take, pin, and king cannot take because of the queen. So then we get check, king c6, and Wesley says, okay, I'm going to block your rooks and play rook b1. Now I am the one threatening rook b6. Except for the fact that here, MVL finds a gorgeous move. Rook takes g2, sacrificing 1 rook for the bishop. Rook takes g3, sacrificing the 2nd rook for the bishop. And Wesley so resigned because if he takes, there is a gorgeous geometric motif of where he just put his rook. 2 rook sacrifices and queen g6 check would lead to an endgame where Wesley So is down 5 pawns, and Wesley So's a damn good player, but Wesley So's not coming back from a game where he's down 5 pawns. A crazy game, and MVL also takes a 1-game lead in his match after 2 rounds. So now we move to the 3rd round, and honestly, we only have one exciting game from this round, and that is the game that I'm going to show you. Every other matchup ended in a draw. So 2-1 between Aronian and Hikaru, 1.5 in Rajaba versus Napo, and MVL and Wesley. MVL is up 2-1. So this is the only exciting game that really occurred in the 3rd round, and it was between Magnus Carlsen and Daniil Dubov. It began relatively peacefully, an early a6. I don't know what that's all about, but Dubov has an interesting way of playing. Magnus goes for this kind of common setup, and Dubov closes the door on him. He's like, we're not gonna have this. We're not gonna have this. And then few trades later, there's a trade on c6, there's a trade here, knight pops into e4, rook defends the bishop. Dubov begins instigating on the queen side. He plays the move bishop to a6, pinning the pawn to the rook. Magnus attacks the knight to move it away. Now we get this, bishop c4, rook f2. Dubov is a fighter, so he immediately throws the queen out to g5, attacking on e3. Not quite, because there's always f4. But queen c1, and again, Dubov is a fighter. Dubov is h5. I mean, let's be serious. Same side attacking. Magnus gets the bishops off the board. Dubov plays rook to b8. Sacrifices the pawn and plays h4. And then wins this back. There is a trade. King h7, queen d7. Okay. Magnus Carlsen, the king of endgames, right? Queen rook 5 versus queen rook 5. His king's under a little bit of pressure here. A little bit of pressure from Dubov. But Dubov very calmly, just plays f6, keeps it all together. Magnus goes for the a5 pawn. Dubov plays the move queen f5, threatening the move h3, and just basically trying to shut the king down. Magnus plays g4, Dubov still plays h3, because if you take, I'm going to take on f3 with check, and you get mated. You will be mated here. You will be mated, I promise. So in the game, we got king to g3, and Dubov played a really interesting move. Queen e4, a move where the queen is untouchable, and the threat is to take on d4. So of course, Magnus says, well, he's going to take my pawn. It's untouchable because of the pin, by the way. If I take the pawn, he's going to take my pawn. The game goes on, right? Except Magnus played queen takes a5, and Dubov played the move f5. And now we really see the problem. It's the same idea as last game. Utilizing the pin, literally the same tactical idea. Now queen takes g4 is mate. That's mate. You are going to get mated. So Magnus takes, and all of a sudden realizes the ceiling of his house just got shredded. The roof got ripped off the house. King's looking up, there's a thunderstorm. Uh-oh, let me go hide under the couch. All right, and now he just hunts him down. And how does he hunt him down? By going 1 step backward to go 2 steps forward, rook to e6, threatening a mate. Magnus scrambles to defend with rook to e2, trying to get away. We get rook to g6, king to f2, the queen, the deathly slide, up 1 square, hitting d4, hitting this, rook is coming in. We get queen back to b1, pinning the rook to the king, but just a very calm slide up of 1 square. And now we get queen d3, queen h2, check, and here Magnus Carlsen resigns the game, because if king d2, very simple, the easiest way to win this, bap, 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 push. Simplify everything and the pawn promotes. Daniil Dubov, after being very close in the second game, strikes back to level it at 1.5 apiece. It is time for the final game of the day. 2 matches are tied. 2 people need to win in order to even the score. First game we go to is the game between Wesley So and Maxime Vachier-Lagrave. We get e4, c5, and a Najdorf. And a Najdorf where, again, they threatened us with repetition, but Wesley So has to win this game. And Wesley So went crazy. He started pushing his pawns. G4, H6, F4. And here, MVL played a move. He played the move knight to H5. And this is where Wesley said, uh-oh. If I take, there's queen to H4, which hits the bishop and the king, and I'm busted. So let me go back. MVL said, let me get that bishop. No more castling. Wesley said, I don't need to castle. All right? I'm going to trade off all these pieces. I don't need to castle. I'm going to walk my king over. My king's walking out to c1. Okay, that's all fine and good, except for the fact that the position here for white is actually just bad. Unfortunately, it's just bad. This knight is extremely good. This knight, on the other hand, has no forward movement, right? The bishop stares at air. There's just nothing there. This bishop will stare down into the king, for example. And yeah, well, MVL just continued. He castles on move 26. Don't do that. See how both these guys, one guy walked his king like 7 moves, that guy castled on move 26. Don't play like them. I know they're really good, but sometimes they're a bad example, okay? And MVL just brought his pieces to the queen side, and what ultimately ended up happening is he infiltrated on the back rank. Look at this back rank infiltration. And he offered a queen trade, and the position here is not losing for Wesley necessarily. I mean, it's bad, it's very unpleasant, and Wesley So just chose to resign the game. I mean, oftentimes what happens in the final round of one of these things, if it's 2-1, the guy with the 2 points just offers a draw out of respect. It's unrated, and oftentimes the person with the 1 point did not have to play so aggressively, but since they have to win to tie the match, the guy with the 2 points says, all right, I'll offer you a draw, it doesn't really matter. And MVL takes a 1-0 lead overall. He now wins the match. Oh, sorry, actually it's 3-1. I forgot, Wesley So resigns, technically. So it's 3-1. The final game I also wanted to show you is the one between Rajabov and Nepo. And I'm going to tell you guys right now that the match between Aronian and Hikaru ended with Aronian 2.5, 1.5, and the final game between Dubov and Carlsen was not so exciting. It ends 2-2. So both Aronian and MVL have 1-0 leads going into tomorrow. Don't leave though. Trust me, this is going to be super instructive. This game, I'm actually going to pick up right here, in this position, between Timur and Nepo. And it's instructive because you are going to learn how to navigate a middle game with symmetrical pawn structure, knight versus bishop, okay? This knight, centralized, defended by 3 different pieces, stands on the light squares. Notice that the counteracting minor piece on g5 doesn't have any sort of control of the light squares. Knight can go 50-50, bishop is 100-0. Then Rajabov builds up a structure of pawns, 5 of them, all on dark squares, cascading to make the bishop more passive. He continues to improve his position little by little, mostly on the light squares, maintaining this level of pressure on Nepo throughout this game to get to an endgame where he potentially will be a pawn up. And it worked. He simplifies, he trades 1 rook. It's instructive, don't trade both. You don't have to trade both rooks. In fact, it's usually better to trade 1. That's kind of the rule of thumb if you're trying to win an endgame. Look at this pressure. And here, Nepo plays g5. A lot of newer players take en passant just because they can. Don't take en passant just because you can. Notice what happens to the structure of the pawns. Black cannot move forward. 1 pawn dominates both. Again, the light squares versus the dark squares. He wins the pawn. And here Timur, in a time trouble, simplifies it down to a knight in 3 versus bishop in 3, which we will analyze. But he had a move here that was very cool. He could have played king g4, and the idea of king g4 is to go here. It doesn't matter that you walk into a check. Why? Because when you move the king back, even if you walk into a second check, just for example, you can move the rook. The point is that you don't want to trade, and if you move the rook anywhere, you lose your knight. But if you move the rook with a check, you can then move your knight. And this is not possible with the pawn on f7. So you play king here, baiting a pawn move out of your opponent to weaken their position. Happens in so many positions. Glad you stuck around, right? But in the game, we got knight c7. And still this endgame is a nightmare to defend because white dominates black on the light squares. Even this endgame, utilizing the knight to win the corner pawn and then bring the knight back. Then using the king as a barrier, as a boxer, shouldering the other king out of the way with the knight, bringing the king closer. All the pieces are on the light squares. Notice that, right? How you can dominate a color complex of a board to get to an endgame. The thing that held Timur back in this game is time trouble. And what ultimately ended up happening is he won the g5 pawn. There could have been a way for him to potentially walk his king to d7 and go around the back, and maybe winning the f7 pawn instead of the g5 pawn would have given him some winning chances. Of course, Computer was out here being like, draw, but that's the thing about computers, they kill human creativity, which is really upsetting. What ended up happening here is he won the pawn, but now how do you draw this? How do you draw this? How do you draw this game? I know it's a draw and it might be a little bit boring, but how do you actually hold this endgame? Because what white wants to do is go here, here, win the pawn, promote. Of course, the bishop can sacrifice itself for both pawns. King and knight cannot beat a king. But this is how you draw it. You have to keep the bishop on this diagonal. Why? Well, because let's say in the game, after bishop to b2, white goes h6, okay, king g8, king f6. Keep the bishop on this diagonal. What is the threat here after king f6? What is the threat? It's not to take, right? Sorry, it's not to take on f7 because you're pinned. You need to maintain the bishop on that diagonal to keep the pin on the king. That is why. If you move the bishop anywhere else, knight takes f7 comes, you lose. And there's another threat here, and it's not this, and but, because, hello? The horse. The horse is hanging. So the players shuffled around for a little bit. Rajabov was looking to win somehow, and he was never able to do it. Ultimately, a short while later, he got to this position. He played g6, and there is one more way you could potentially win an endgame like this, to shield the knight, or shield the bishop with the knight, and then try to promote, but he couldn't do it like this. See? Knight g7. But the king constantly, the king and the knight both constantly defend, and you can't use the knight as a shield. You will lose the knight. So the bishop gets back, and that's it. The game just ends in a draw with a lot of repeating. You say, Levy, this was an anticlimactic finish. Hey, it was an instructive one, right? So if you stuck around to learn this lesson on how to navigate color complexes, knight versus bishop positions, putting pawns on the same color square as the enemy bishop, and then transitioning to an active king, active piece endgame, you learned. We learned a lot in this video, and that's why these recaps are so fun. So at the end of the first day of action, Nepo and Rajabov, all square. Carlsen and Dubov, all square. But MVL and Aronian are winning their matches 1-0. Tomorrow there is more rapid chess to be played, and after that, 4 people will go home, or should I say, stay home.